Hello and welcome to Inequality Talks, a podcast from the volunteers of the Economic Inequality Group at Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke, Aarhus. Each episode we discuss a different topic or idea related to questions of economics and economic inequality, learning and sharing knowledge about what that thing is and how we can approach it. I'm Adam, and talking today we have Elise.
Hi.
Sebastien.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about GDP and well-being, or in other terms, money and happiness. GDP is one of those key terms we hear a lot about, and we hear it used a lot, but we don't get it explained or analysed very often. So in basic terms, what is GDP? On the most basic level, it stands for Gross Domestic Product, and that's taken to mean a monetary measure of all the economic activity that takes place within a given nation's borders. And that's as opposed to GNP, which stands for Gross National Product, which is a measure of all the economic activity of the nation's residents. These are two different things. If you've heard GDP used in a discussion or in the news or something like that, it's often used as a kind of fairly objective measure of how a nation and how a nation's residents are doing, what their standard of living is, how things are going. The bigger the GDP and the faster its growth, the better things are going is the general impression you might get. And there may be some truth in that. It sounds pretty simple. It sounds pretty nice and clear-cut. But it's not. It's slightly more complex. There's some big questions to be asked about how we use GDP and whether it is the best measure of well-being. And it's not nearly as objective as it first seems. Today, we aim to demystify GDP a little bit. We'll dig into what it actually measures, how it's used, what flaws there might be in the way we use it, and what alternatives there might be. From there, we enter into the territory of age-old questions of money and happiness, and broader questions of what society should aim for and how they might measure it, like wealth, happiness, well-being, democracy. All of these things, of course, are central to questions of economic inequality. Before we get going, let's introduce ourselves a little more and give just a sentence or two of where we're coming from, what our perspective is. Elise, would you like to start?
Hi, as Adam said, my name is Elise. I'm relatively new here to MS and to the Economic Equality Group, but I've been really enjoying myself here. And a bit about my background, I just finished studying my master's in socio-ecological economics and policy. So we've had a lot of conversations about the shortcomings of GDP, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you all.
And Sebastien?
So my name is Sebastien, as you said. I'm from Belgium, originally. That's where I grew up. And if I need to say a word about my background, it's like mostly I'm an activist, and I've been doing that for the past few years in many different ways. And what's interesting me in this group and studying stuff like GDP is that we were actually just a few days ago making an event to listen to the first podcast we produced. And one of the reflections that came up in the discussion after is that, actually it's not just as easy as implementing one stuff like basic income to solve all problems. And I think that's very much for me the point of this group is to learn to study the complexity of the world in which we live, to understand what is behind like the discussion that we generally have. Because grasping this complexity, I believe, will allow us to be able to look at actual change that we want and can implement.
Thank you. And I'm Adam, as I mentioned. My perspective is also slightly academic, more of a history and philosophy and literature background. But as with Sebastien, I'm very interested in the complexities of topics, and specifically with GDP. As I said, it's a thing we use all the time, we hear used all the time, but historically it's quite new. Historically, our conceptions of what economics is and how economics works are quite new. And when you know these things, it really changes how you understand how they frame the way we look at the world. So I gave a little bit of an introduction to GDP, but is there anything we want to add? What is GDP?
I think it's really relevant to discuss the ways GDP is actually measured. So there are 3 different kinds of ways to measure it. One is the expenditure way of measuring, one is the income way of measuring, and one is the production, which is much less common. But let's just take one way of measuring for matters of simplicity, let's take the expenditure way. So the components of GDP are basically the sum of consumption, government spending, investment, and net exports. And just to be a little bit more specific about what those components actually are, consumption is the total amount of spending from each household. Investment is what firms spend on things like machinery and rent and stuff. Government purchases includes, all of the money that governments spend, like on military, for example, excluding transfer payments. So that means things like unemployment benefits, things like Social Security. So that's excluded. And then net exports is what you export minus what you import. And kind of the inherent logic in that is that it increases GDP to have a larger export than import. That's just simple subtraction.
So we've got this vague idea of GDP as it appears on the news, but what is it actually used for?
Well, governments use the GDP the central banks use the GDP to set their interest policy, for example. Private companies use the GDP to gauge the investment climate. GDP also plays a role in consumer behavior because, GDP is so prevalent in the media. So the GDP figure and the narrative around the GDP figure affects the consumer's confidence and expectations. Politicians often use it also to please their voters. So since there's so much hype about the GDP, that's something that voters look at and can point to, if the GDP has increased or decreased during someone's term. So politicians often use it. It's often also used as justification for other policies like tax cuts. So politicians will say, okay, well, we can cut these taxes because it will increase GDP, or we can avoid doing this because it will decrease GDP. And a really good example of that is the Kyoto Protocol, because there was some report that came out. I can't remember what it was called, and I don't know who wrote it. But there was a report or several reports that came out about the Kyoto Protocol and how, which for those of you who don't know, it was one of the first climate treaties, which said that this treaty would, decrease GDP. And then the U.S. never ratified it. So that's one example of how GDP can be used to justify not doing something good and used to justify doing something I would argue is bad, like tax cuts.
So where does this association between GDP and well-being come from? Why is it that these things are so closely associated?
I think you can link that to the growth paradigm. And our society has kind of created this narrative about growth and kind of prioritized it on a political level. And it's kind of tied into there's the research that says GDP is correlated with certain things like literacy, for example, or mortality or longer life. And so there are these underlying assumptions that that's because of GDP. Mm-hmm. And so we automatically associate GDP with better life. Mm-hmm. And then also I think there's some of consumer culture too that's involved, the kind of this idea that we're kind of fed that we need to buy our happiness.
Yeah. So, there's also some kind of core ideological stuff going on there and advertising kind of a political narrative. But I suppose it's important to note with these correlations, right? There are historical periods where these tools were developed. They were useful in a certain sense. There's problems with them, but they were useful. And there was at least correlation with these improvements. It was used as a proxy for certain things, like we mentioned. But once you reach a certain stage in recent years, some of those correlations don't hold. Some of those things
of mortality.
Yeah, but some of the things of mortality no longer hold in the same way, or life expectancy, as we might call it, or childhood death rates. That's one of the key things in Wilkinson and Pickett's research. All these things no longer hold in the last 30 years, which have also seen massively increasing inequality.
Yes, and even if we could see correlations of increased level of life, well-being,
standard of living.
So even if you can see some correlation between GDP and increased standard of living after the Second World War, there's also a strong correlation between increased standard of living in the Western countries or the global North countries and colonization and imperialism and extraction of wealth from the global South. So it's not a clear question that it's just because GDP was growing, so our life was increasing. It's also we were stealing from other part of the world and our standard of living was increasing. So we need to remember that also when we talk about this period as like the golden standard of what social democracy could be and everything like that. And just to also say that, and from the start, GDP needs to be read as something political. In the sense that it's only calculating as valuable, like what are commodities, so things that can be bought and sold on the market. And it's very much counting as positive the fact of making profit. So it's very much serving one specific, I would say, social class, which is as owners of our. And so for me, like even from the start, even if we could correlate it with some increase in standard of living, it's always a political reading.
So I mean, the very important saying that all scientists love: correlation is not causation. But also, what we're talking in both of your examples, what we're talking about here is the power of a narrative, a certain kind of narrative that surrounds this and says, this is what caused this thing. It's very simple. You can understand it. This number goes up. It produces all of these good things. And it's not as simple because of all the issues of what actually happened in those time periods and also what is being measured.
Yeah, and this narrative of more market makes a better life for everyone.
Yes.
It's a very strong in our society since a few centuries now. The use at first, like when you talk about like GNP, it was during the war, was because there was a war, you needed to produce a lot of guns and tanks and planes. And so these tools were like designed in order to like follow up and be able to read your production and how is it going and are you producing enough for the war effort.
Right.
And after the Second World War, you needed to reconstruct everything. So it was a very good tool in order to be able to see, who is good at reconstructing, at what speed, how do we produce in order to like build back the infrastructure that we need for society. So at that time, it made some sort of sense, I would say.
I think it's important to note for future reference, these are times of crisis when these things became very useful. Times of crisis and destruction and things going wrong.
And I think that's also like this historical reading is very important because we talk a lot about like, we don't have that much growth for the moment. Our economy are like in a is it a slam that you say in English? Like when the rate of growth is
boom and bust.
No, like the economy is slowing down. The growth every year. No, that's when it's going down. But like when it's a very small growth,
like it's slowing down. I think
it's slowing. Like you would say that the economy is slowing down when you compare it to like the glorious 30s after the Second World War. But actually, it's because GDP it just calculates the amount of value that is produced every year in like the augmentation, like the added value. And of course, when you build back a whole society and buildings and institutions, and you're going to have much more growth because you need to make a much bigger effort to build new things rather than to maintain them. And GDP doesn't take account of what already exists.
Yeah, but I think we're getting too much into the limitations and the shortcomings because it's so easy to slip into that conversation because there are so many. But I mean, I'm not in favor of the GDP index at all. But one could argue that it is good for comparing countries' economies.
Because parts of countries' economies, perhaps.
Yeah, the production of different economies.
Yeah.
That's all. That was just it. I don't have anything else.
Yeah. When we get into the criticisms, which we are going to get into clearly, there is an argument also, we're often speaking from a Western perspective, and in certain countries where things aren't being met, where you do need, basic needs aren't being met, where you do need construction, where you do need industry, it can still, in a certain sense, be useful. You could argue there's also certain other measures that would still be more useful in that context, but we're speaking from a very Western perspective here, so it's important to note that.
It's an interesting attempt. it's problematic in many ways, but to say that we want to be able to capture the idea of the economic performance of a country in only one number,
it's
like,
utopian in a way.
I think
it's just not very useful.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it is that thing. That's the beauty of money in a sense. Also, GDP is that you can reduce the value of everything down to one thing, and then you can compare it super easily. And that's what money is, because it makes exchange possible. But okay, so we want to go there. Let's get into the flaws.
The juice.
So, I think it's important to reiterate what Sebastien said and what we've talked about. These things came often in times of crisis. And one thing I noted that I read in a book, Utopia for Realists, there was an economist who actually pointed out that yes, what year was it? The Fukuyama tsunami, and Japan was devastated by the tsunami. An economist pointed out that, yes, it was very tragic, but there is a silver lining, because a catastrophe like that is really good for GDP, because they need to rebuild everything. So that's it's useful in that sense. But if catastrophes are a positive measure in this, you have to take that into account and then think about the stuff that isn't measured in that.
And I think for me, maybe the very first flaw of such a tool as GDP that is so prevalent in our lives and in the way that we think the world, so that we even think that the catastrophe can be very good because it will make a lot of economic activity, is that the way it was made in the first place is not democratic. I mean, it's a bunch of economists that came together with an idea, like all the national accounts processes. It was very technocrats, and then it was validated or no by the administration in place at that time. But there was never a very democratic discussion or a question of how do we calculate value in our society. So, yeah.
Even with that, Kuznets, who was one of the key technocratic figures, came to be very cautious about his own invention after it kind of took off after him, because it was a much more limited scope.
I mean, I even wrote a quote by him. He writes, or he says, "The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income."
Right. And this is the guy who actually
from the dude who.
But that's the thing, right? So it measures certain things, but it measures a quantity of production effectively, and certain different kinds of production, but it doesn't measure the quality of an activity. And it might not measure certain things we consider important, or it might measure things that we don't consider important. Again, one of my favorite accounts of it was thinking in terms of a family that, all the stuff we talk about now to be eco-friendly, reusing things, repairing your clothes, growing your own food, all of that kind of stuff, that's bad for GDP. What's good for GDP?
Well, it's not included.
Well, yes, but it's bad in the sense that it won't increase it. And the aim is to increase it. What's good is compulsive gamblers who have incredible medical debt, and spend and throw stuff away and buy on Black Friday and throw everything out. That's great for the economy, and not great, for instance, for the environment or necessarily their mental or physical well-being.
Yeah, or smoking.
Yes, smoking's great. You get paid multiple times for smoking, because then you obviously you have the expenditure of the smoker, then you have their medical bills,
expenses, sure,
if you have it privatized.
Yeah. Not to mention that it also doesn't account for any of the harmful practices of corporate activity that is included in GDP. Just to bring in a contemporary example, I just read this article in the New York Times about Nike and Coca-Cola and their efforts to try to weaken a bill that would ban products from being bought from forced labor camps in China that are, goods that are produced by the Muslim minority in China that's being subjected to numerous human rights violations. And that's just one example of some immoral activity by multinational corporations. But I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. And their production, the products they produce, Nike shoes that have been proven to be produced in these forced labor camps, that's part of GDP.
Mm-hmm. It's a positive. Yeah, so it doesn't measure. And these aren't things we really want to become because if you included that in GDP, if you put a monetary value on it, there would reach a point potentially where you go, okay, it's expensive to use these labor camps because of the added cost of suffering, but it could still be profitable. So it comes into the accounts. The obvious way around is to commodify everything. But you really don't want to do that, because then things can be neglected, or you can put a money price on them that you can then pay for.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of shortcomings in GDP, and we can go a long time, and we can try to make maybe a list of them that can be comprehensive, because what we want to do here is also to get people that are going to listen to this to be able to have tools to reflect critically when we hear that we need, because the GDP is very tied to growth, and that we need more GDP because that will allow us to have more economic activity, less unemployment, because I think that's kind of at least for me the idea I got from the media is that we need that in order to have more jobs and people can have better lives, and even that is not true. If you look at the numbers, in 1975 in France, GDP was 1,000 billion of euro, and there was 3.4% of unemployment. And in 2014 in France, GDP was 2,179 billion of euros, so more than 2 times more. And there was more than 10% of unemployment. Which means having more money in the society doesn't solve the problem of unemployment. Just only because of productivity gains. We did a lot of stuff like computers, smartphone, a lot of automation. Right. And so even that idea that producing more, I'm always talking between Marx, but even Marx was already saying we can end up, it is quote, we can end up producing too many useful things that would result in producing too many useless people. We produce so much that there's not even space for people in the economy.
But your statistic kind of brings me to probably the most prominent criticism of GDP, which is that it does not represent inequality at all, because it's an aggregate figure. So GDP per capita, that's GDP over the population, that doesn't say anything about the richest or the poorest. It just says this is the GDP over the population number. And that's a huge, huge problem, because, inequality is such an important economic welfare indicator, maybe if not the most important. And to not include it in the most prominent economic indicator is just stupid, honestly. Yeah. And it's misinformative.
That's also ties to the work of Wilkinson and Pickett, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's to explain, it's two researchers that show that, of course, until a certain point, it can be correlated.
Money and happiness, you mean?
Yeah. It shows that until a certain point, maybe they correlate, but over a certain point, they don't correlate anymore.
Yeah, exactly. There's there are 3 reasons why GDP is stupid in this way, in this happiness discussion. One is exactly what you say, this threshold, that there could be this, and there is statistically proven a threshold where income stops having a correlation with happiness. And then there's relative income, meaning that, the income of the people around you matters. If I'm super poor and Adam is my neighbor and he's having a Lamborghini and a super nice pool and having nice barbecues all the time, I'm not going to be so happy. And at least I'll be less happy than if I were surrounded by people in the same financial situation. And then the third reason is that GDP doesn't, and this way of measuring isn't accounting for people's ability to adapt. And so there might be a negative correlation with a decrease associated with a decrease in income, but then that might level off or increase again. So basically, humans are super adaptable. We adapt to our circumstances, and this happiness debate kind of leaves out that.
And I think that's one of the key things of that Wilkinson Pickett research is that thing that inequality itself, not just poverty, but inequality, relative levels, cause all of those health issues, health inequalities, happiness inequalities, like you say. They measure tons of areas. But there was a historical period where, yes, GDP increased, and that generally correlated with increased well-being. At least in the West, that's
correlated too, not caused.
Yes.
That's an important distinction.
Correlation, not causation. But that's the thing. In certain senses, then, also GDP is a proxy for things. If they don't have infrastructure, we can maybe use GDP to go, okay, as it increases, that generally indicates an increase in infrastructure. Or we could have some measures for infrastructure. It's not the thing itself, it's what it is a proxy for measuring. And in different societies, it's going to be measuring different things based on what we've decided to measure, but also based on what is going on in those societies, what those societies already have and what they don't have. But okay, do you have more that you want to go into?
I mean, they're just there are so many problems that we could get into.
Because
but
we even didn't talk about the environment. And
we didn't talk about that at all. We didn't talk about how, things that it doesn't exclude, or that it excludes, like environmental and social externalities like pollution and resource degradation, and how it doesn't include assets like human capital, natural capital, and I don't even like those terms, human capital, natural. I'm talking in pure macroeconomic terms, but that makes for a really bad national accounting indicator, because when you're accounting for something, you should account for both the assets and the liabilities, and this just accounts only for the costs. The GDP only, that's just bad accounting, honestly. And it's not a good national accounting measure.
And for me, the point that I really want to make across with this, at least for myself, is that these kind of economic indicator or social economic, they don't just passively reflect reality. They're also part of how we understand it and the shape of view of it. And that's why we need to be able to criticize them and to think about how we want to actually define value. How do we want to actually define progress or things like that? This is a democratic enjeu.
Can't help you there.
This is a democratic question, and we need to claim it and take ownership of it.
Okay, so it includes things that don't provide us value. It excludes things that do centrally provide us value. It doesn't include things that are hugely detrimental to the environment. It hides their true cost. It doesn't measure the quality of the thing, only the quantity of the thing. It doesn't measure... It's imprecise. It doesn't measure inequalities. Depending on how you measure it, it varies hugely. It's also very linked to ideas of growth and the whole growth idea, and that is also hugely problematic in a climate thing, and it relates to sort of our political objectives and how it's politically defined.
Yeah.
These are all the areas.
And so now that we criticized for a very long time, are we going to talk about what we can do?
Let's talk about some alternatives, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
So where do we go now? We say we want much happier societies.
Yeah, so the key thing we're talking about here is, okay, GDP has this association with well-being, but that association isn't necessarily true because of all these things it does and doesn't measure and doesn't include, that aren't the true sort of things that make a good life or that are valuable. Let's broaden that out. So what are the alternatives? I suppose there's two different questions here. We can tackle them in whatever order. But what alternatives have people proposed, and what more broadly do we think are things that are valuable to measure?
Well, in terms of measurements to either replace or to adjust GDP, there are many different alternatives that researchers have already come up with. Well, you can have, like I said, an adjustment of GDP, which is still kind of economic welfare indicators using things like, in addition to consumption, also measures like leisure and inequality. Just to give you a quick example, France's GDP in 2005 was 67% of the US's, but in France, people were working 535 hours a year, and in the US, 877. So yeah, we can use other measures like that to include. And there are some, I'm just going to read some names: Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, Genuine Progress Indicator, Sustainable Net Benefit Index. So yeah, these are pragmatic adjustments to GDP. But then you also have measures that include only environmental externalities and natural resource depletion. And there's this one called the Sustainable National Income, or SNI, and it was made for the Netherlands. And they found a huge gap between, or an ever-increasing gap between GDP and SNI, which would imply that the production over time has become even more and more environmentally degrading. And then there's also, thirdly, there is an indicator to measure wealth instead, because GDP doesn't measure wealth at all, which would be the sum of the whole economy's human and natural capital. I know you don't like those terms, neither do I, Adam, but for the sake of conversation. And that's called genuine savings, GS. And then the last one, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, are these composite social indexes, like the Human Development Index, HDI. Also capabilities approach, Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. Yeah, the critique of that is that they're kind of arbitrary in the things that you choose to measure, or they're at least, subject to biases, and especially Western biases. So that's something to be aware of.
Yeah, and it's always useful to have a variety of indicators. And actually, today, a bunch of countries are using not only GDP, but other indicators to evaluate their policies. I know that Belgium is using a bundle of, I don't know. But as you say, Adam, GDP is still such a strong narrative in our societies, so that it's useful to have other indicators, but it's also important to have a democratic discussion about this narrative. And we live in this time of Corona, and we hear so much about we need to get the economy back up. But if we use GDP as an indicator for that, as the standard that we're going to use to calculate if we're going well or not, all these things that are care, or the real economy, or essential workers, that the people that work in the supermarkets, and the people that pick up the trash, and all these people, they're still not going to be considered as very valuable and essential to our societies. So we need to have both these indicators, but also this political discussion about what is it that as a society we value, and how do we use this indicator to reflect that.
And I think this actually ties to, like you mentioned, I don't like the term human capital, I don't like the term natural capital, and that's for me one of my core critiques of GDP as well, is that it's this idea that all you have to do is find the right way to quantify something in monetary terms, and then it's fine. Right?
Right.
But some things are qualitative. Once you reach that point, you go, in the coronavirus instance, and you get people that are pretty explicitly saying this, you go, okay, yes, it's sad that people are dying, but their lives are worth $1 million. And if we let them die and work in the shops, that's okay in an economic sense. And I don't think you can... I think some indicators, you can't just reduce them to those qualitative things and try and reduce to a single number and a single criteria. That's kind of the aim of capitalism in a certain sense, but I think that's the key issue here.
And that's another critique of the GDP, that it doesn't measure any kind of improvement in quality or technology, for one. And there's this example that I read the other day about medicine, and how a new medicine to cure, I don't know, what's something that hasn't been cured yet? Let's just say a vaccine. And people are buying the vaccine for corona, if they have to buy it, and that would increase GDP by maybe a certain margin, but the increase in quality of the life and the lives that would be saved, for example, are way higher than this marginal increase in GDP, for example.
I mean, I think let's give a concrete example here of healthcare in the US. There you go. It's great for the GDP what happens with healthcare in the US, because there's a lot more expenditure. It's terrible for the people. And that's a concrete difference there. There's a concrete conflict between the economic measure and the well-being, if we're talking about well-being. But perhaps we're going to move on to, you said we need a democratic debate around it. Let's talk about those things. What's valuable? Obviously, we're not going to solve that here, and clearly there's people working on other measures. But what is it? Is it happiness we're looking for? Or what is it?
I personally don't believe it's happiness. I mean, my very personal belief is that whatever it is that we decide that matters, it needs to be a democratic debate. I don't think it's so much happiness as democratic control. We need to be able to have a debate about what is essential to our life and how do we manage it together. And that the market is not the best tool for that. For other things it is, but not for that. And like indicators can help us, but before everything, I believe in talking together and figuring it out.
And the key thing like there is that having GDP as this very powerful indicator, as this narrative, locks you into a certain economic system. Like I think we can all agree, at least now we can, air being privatized is a bad thing. If we started privatizing air so you had to pay for it, that wouldn't be great. But that's the end logic of it.
Yeah,
people
sure.
try and privatize water.
That is happening.
So it ties you into a system where the only way to operate your economy is on the terms of that growth logic and on the terms of that expenditure logic, which isn't necessarily the best for people.
But I think it's the question of happiness is a very private matter. And I don't think... And happiness means something different to everybody. And it varies across cultures what happiness is and how to express happiness. And I don't think it's the role of governments and national statistics offices to decide what makes us happy. I think that's where I take a capabilities approach and say it's the job of the government to ensure that we are capable of living our best life. And that means having good health, having good education, having democracy too, having good social infrastructure. These things that can contribute to your happiness if that's what makes you happy, you know. We don't need to, I don't think we need to sit here and discuss what makes us happy, because we all know individually what makes us happy.
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of what we talk about here as well with GDP is it guides our behavior in a certain way and says all the increases in productivity, the increases of things in society, they have to be put into this one goal of increasing productivity. That doesn't align with what we're doing. We want, in a certain sense, what we're talking about here is granting people freedom. The freedom to, what is it? What's the American one? The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Fundamentally, that's the thing. But how do you actualize that? And yeah, there's a long tradition, thousands of years, probably as long as we've existed, of like not necessarily happiness. I think on some level we do accept the utilitarian idea of happiness as like in the broadest sense of well-being and fulfillment. I don't think we should sacrifice ourselves and be miserable for the higher goal of I don't know what. We also have to take into consideration things non-human. We have to take into account biodiversity as well in any kind of social measure, as people try to do. We're not going to get to the bottom of like, you know, what is the good life? I think philosophers have been trying to do that for thousands and thousands of years. They've come up with some good points. Yeah,
I mean, if you go talk about philosopher, like I would say that for me, then I would go with something like Spinoza, like that happiness is determined by the social condition that you live in and the world that is around you. And
that's
so
exactly my point.
Yeah, like the way you understand it, and in a world that is like all about markets and merchandise, then happiness is also determined by these factors.
Spinoza's not one I have on my list. I got Buddhism, Stoicism, Epicureanism. Yeah, I got Aristotle.
And for me, it's more like, as you say, it's like having some basic infrastructures and public services that are of quality and that allows people to live their life in a way that they don't have to stress about their basic needs. I think that's like an important thing that we need to calculate. And that's, for me, that's the whole point of this group. It's to be able to critically together analyze the situation we are in. Not take it for granted that it has always been like this and that we cannot change anything. Then being able to decide collectively on the society we want. That's what's most important for me. Like, happiness is something that...
Happiness is something that's incidental. Yeah. I mean, that does show up in a lot of happiness research, actually, that like, as much as there's different ways of measuring it, but actively pursuing happiness as the end goal tends not to make people happy. Pursuing other goals does. So we're going to have to bring this to a close. So where do we wrap this up? Like, what is your conclusion when it comes to measures or how we look at these things?
As much as I can say, I don't think I have like one finite conclusion, also that I need to learn more still. But yes, and that's also the whole interest with this process is that the more I look, the more I learn about the complexities, and the more I realize that there is not one simple solution. But one other thing that maybe I got to realize doing and talking about this today also is that we look at GDP very critically, and we realize all the issue with it, and it's somehow ironic because we tend to be very easy, at least when I read the media, to see biases in other traditions and other cultures, and not to look at our own. And when we actually do the work to analyze this, then we realize that in our own way of thinking and on organizing society is very biased, and there's a lot to critique. And I think that's an interesting take from this session for me, and that makes me even more wanting to actually look at other traditions from other cultures, and I think about indigenous cultures and way of organizing the economy, and see if I can get inspired by that rather than think that it's just weird and not how it should be because it's not what I'm familiar with. Mm-hmm. So just like trying to get inspired by other way of organizing the economy than the one that we have here.
Elise?
Okay. I don't think I have any nice, like, sexy way to sum anything up. But, yeah, I would just say that the more I researched this, the more I looked into it, the more convinced I was that the GDP's gotta go. It's just a really useless indicator, and it really feeds into the growth paradigm, this growth imperative. And as a supporter of degrowth policies or post-growth policies, I am not in favor of that prioritization, because ultimately it's not what's good for society, it's not what's good for the planet. So that was super pessimistic. So let me think of something positive.
I mean, you don't have to have a positive take on everything.
Well, I think it's super cool that a lot of researchers are like on top of this. I think they actually have been for quite a while now. It's just the public that needs to catch up, or like, you know, the decision makers that need to catch up and take the lobbyists out of there.
That would benefit a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's very true. When I see, just because what I was talking about, like the amount of intellectual production about the idea of commons, I think there is so much to get inspired from today. Like that comes from like thinking about alternatives. So yeah, we just need to find the step to bring it a bit further.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think one of the things that's more difficult about this topic, perhaps, than the previous ones, is it's hard to like have a concrete, like, here's a policy proposal, we should do this thing, or these are some cool, because clearly people are working on measures, right? The question is more of that fluffy but really important question of, okay, so why aren't those other measures the ones that are now being adopted? Like, there's clearly something and many processes going on to promote GDP.
Yeah, it's about changing a worldview.
Yeah.
And that's not like something that's done overnight.
And I've said it before, and I probably say it again, and that's the importance of like being political, of like treating it as like something that is political, because that's what it is, and we need to treat it as such and take this question up.
And so it's less a measure of finding new measures, but more a question of changing narrative and worldview. And I do, on some level, fundamentally believe that at least part of what we should aim for in a society is happiness in the broadest sense, of like people being fulfilled and having well-being and stuff. Like, I don't think we should aim for a society based on family honor necessarily, or that kind of stuff. But we also have to take into consideration all the other non-human things, the well-being of animals, the well-being of plant life, the well-being of the universe. And these are philosophical discussions, and it's that balance also, because one of the things that's so appealing potentially about GDP, as well as that it benefits some powerful people, is that it's simple. It's really easy when you have that one number. You can only do that so much. And that, yeah, as you say, that's what being, to a certain extent, being political is. So it's more a question of maybe changing the narrative at the same time that you're changing the economic and political structure to enable us to spend more time thinking about changing the narrative. So we're going to have to stop it there. Thank you, everyone. Clearly, we learned some interesting things today. The research will hopefully be in the podcast notes once we get it up there. Please go and check out Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke Aarhus on Facebook, Instagram, and on the website, if there is one. Come down to the cafe when it's open, if there's no coronavirus restrictions on. And we look forward to next time, where I think we'll be talking about the gender pay gap. But we're going to get onto a lot of interesting topics like growth and taxes at some point in the future.